What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The thing about family is, you think there's a bottom to the well of humiliation, and then, just when you start to feel like maybe things have settled, they throw you in headfirst all over again and remind you that nope, there's still plenty more down there. That was Christmas for me every year, like clockwork. But this one? This one was special. This year, my father stood up in the middle of dinner, carved turkey in one hand, and practically shouted across the table with this proud-as-hell glint in his eye, "Your brother just got a Porsche." Isn't that incredible? When will you finally grow up and do something impressive with your life, Rachel? I remember the way he said it, like he was tossing me a casual jab, a playful nudge, something I should be able to laugh off, but everyone at the table knew what it was. It was a reminder, just like always, that Derek was the winner in our family, and I was still the one with the potential that somehow never materialized into anything Dad could brag about to the guys at the golf club. I looked up from my plate, met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't smile. I didn't force a polite chuckle. I just took a slow sip of wine, the kind of measured, intentional sip that lets everyone know you're about to say something you've been rehearsing in your head for months. Then I said, maybe I'll grow up when he stops crying about the loan I rejected. And just like that, the whole table went dead quiet. You could hear the fireplace crackling in the living room. You could hear the hum of the fridge from the kitchen. What you didn't hear was Derek, because he suddenly had nothing to say, not a joke, not a protest, not even that cocky little laugh he usually leaned on whenever he got caught being an idiot. And my dad, who a second earlier was practically giddy with pride, sat there looking like someone had just slapped him across the face with a copy of Derek's credit score. Let me rewind a bit. Because this wasn't about a car. It wasn't even really about Derek. It was about something that had been brewing for over 30 years, little insults, constant comparisons, and the quiet way my dad had spent my entire life pretending my achievements didn't count unless they looked good on a bumper sticker or came with some kind of flashy upgrade. I was the sensible one, the one who always showed up on time, paid her own bills, took care of things without drama. And that meant I was also the invisible one. Derek? He was the golden boy. Even when he failed, even when he screwed up, even when he took out loans he couldn't pay back or crashed my dad's truck in high school and tried to blame it on faulty brakes, he was met with nothing but second chances and proud smiles. He could have robbed a bank and Dad would have found a way to spin it into an entrepreneurial lesson. So when he rolled up in that Porsche earlier that afternoon, just in time for Christmas dinner, you'd have thought the second coming had arrived in the driveway. Everyone ran to the window. Dad rushed out to slap him on the back like he'd just finished a tour in Iraq. "That's my son," he beamed, eyes practically watering with pride. "That's how you live." Meanwhile, I was inside, helping Mom set the table and trying not to laugh out loud at the absurdity of it. Because what no one else knew, and what Derek obviously hadn't mentioned, was that 3 months earlier, he'd come to me, hat in hand, asking me to co-sign a loan so he could invest in his business. Except by business, he meant lease a Porsche for 5 years because appearances matter. I said no. Not because I couldn't afford to help, I could, but because I knew what it would lead to. Derek had a long, colorful history of treating responsibilities like suggestions and loans like donations. I wasn't about to put my name on something I knew he had no intention of following through on. What stung the most wasn't even that he asked. It was what he said when I hesitated. "Come on, Ratch," he smirked, "you don't even have kids or a mortgage. You just sit in your little apartment with your spreadsheets and your cats. This is nothing to you." He said it like I owed him. Like my financial discipline and independence were just signs of a life not fully lived. So I declined. Politely, firmly, and finally. And apparently, he found someone else willing to take a risk. Or maybe he went through a shady lender, I'd find out later. But what mattered was, now he was flaunting the car like he'd earned it, like it was some symbol of success instead of a desperate attempt to cover up the truth. And my father, God bless him, ate it up like Christmas ham. Until I reminded them both that nothing comes without strings. So there we sat, forks paused in midair, gravy cooling on the mashed potatoes, as my words hung in the air like cigar smoke, thick, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Derek opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, then picked up his wine glass and drank like he was hoping it would erase the last 60 seconds. Dad tried to recover with a cough, a laugh, anything, but the moment was already gone. The spotlight had moved. And for the first time, they didn't know what to do with it. That was the first real silence I'd ever heard in that house. Not angry silence, not awkward silence, power silence. The kind that settles in when people start realizing the game has changed, and they're not holding the cards they thought they were. And that was just the start of the Christmas from hell. Looking back, I don't think there was ever a moment in my childhood when the scoreboard between Derek and me wasn't already tilted heavily in his favor, and no matter how many times I tried to balance it with perfect report cards, quiet responsibility, or the kind of cautious, consistent behavior that would make any normal parent proud, it simply didn't matter. Not in our house, not with our father, not when Derek could walk into any room, flash that smug little grin of his, tell half a story about something that didn't happen the way he said it did, and suddenly become the hero of the day, while I was lucky if anyone even noticed I was still sitting there. It started small, as these things often do, with Derek getting the bigger slice of cake at birthdays because he's a growing boy, or being allowed to skip out on chores while I scrubbed the dishes in silence, and whenever I brought it up. Whenever I pointed out the imbalance or dared to suggest that maybe we weren't playing by the same rules, the response was always the same dismissive chuckle from our father and the tight-lipped smile from our mother, who never agreed with him out loud but never contradicted him either, preferring the quiet safety of neutrality over the mess of confrontation. By the time we were teenagers, the gap had turned into a canyon. Derek was 17 when he crashed Dad's truck into a stop sign, blamed it on the brakes, and instead of being grounded or punished, he was met with a ruffled hair and a "well, at least you're okay, son," while I, a straight-A student who had never so much as missed curfew, got lectured for reminding Dad that the truck wasn't even insured at the time. That's how it always was. I wasn't the daughter. I was the critic, the nag, the cold one, as Derek liked to say, and no matter how successful I became or how far I climbed professionally, it was never enough to outweigh the sheer magnetic pull my brother had on our father's ego. There's something uniquely infuriating about being the adult in the family from the age of 12, and yet being treated like the one who never really lived. I paid for my own college education, worked 2 part-time jobs while Derek dropped out of community college after 1 semester because the professors were all idiots, and while I was learning to budget rent, utilities, and student loans down to the cent, he was out launching one half-baked business idea after another: car detailing, crypto mining, even a beard oil company, and somehow, no matter how spectacularly each venture failed, our father saw him as a visionary, a risk-taker, a future mogul just waiting for his moment. It didn't matter that Derek borrowed money from everyone, friends, family, even once from my mom's bridge group, and never paid any of it back. It didn't matter that he defaulted on a lease, that he once faked a back injury to avoid paying rent to a roommate, or that he constantly walked around with this air of self-importance, as if the world owed him success simply for showing up. What mattered, at least to Dad, was that Derek was bold, exciting, unpredictable, and male, which, in our house, meant a leader by default. Meanwhile, my achievements were always treated like footnotes. When I bought my first condo at 27, completely on my own, with no help from anyone, Dad didn't even ask to see pictures. He told me I was playing it safe and warned me that women who focus too much on money usually miss the window for kids. When I got promoted to senior financial analyst at my firm, he said, "That's great, but do you ever think about starting a family instead of just running numbers all day?" It didn't matter what I did. It wasn't that he didn't see it. It was that he didn't want to. It didn't fit the narrative he liked, the one where Derek was the ambitious one with the fire, and I was just the dependable older sister, the safety net, the background character in someone else's story. That dynamic didn't just sting, it warped me. It taught me to be quiet, to swallow resentment, to solve problems privately and never complain, because complaining made you difficult, and being difficult meant you didn't get invited back into the inner circle of family approval, which I was barely clinging to anyway. I internalized the idea that asking for fairness made you seem ungrateful, and that any recognition I got would have to be earned in complete silence, without expectation, without drama. And that's exactly why, when Derek showed up at my door last spring, leaning against the frame like he was some kind of charming movie character, wearing a too-tight button-up and a fake leather watch, asking if I could co-sign a loan so he could get a real car, something that reflects where my company's going, I didn't slam the door in his face. I listened. I even made him coffee. Because even after all these years, part of me still clung to the fantasy that if I did the right thing one more time, if I was just generous and kind and patient one more time, maybe, just maybe, it would finally be seen. He talked for almost an hour about his latest venture, some vague affiliate marketing scheme he was convinced would blow up in the next quarter, and how a Porsche would help him signal credibility. I asked him why he needed that car specifically. He laughed and said, "Rachel, come on. You wouldn't understand. You work in finance. I live in perception." He said it like it was a badge of honor. Like working with numbers, with real accountability, was somehow the lesser world, and his fantasy land of branding and leased vehicles and image management was the future. But what hit me hardest, what broke something loose in me, wasn't the arrogance or the entitlement or even the assumption that I would say yes. It was the part where he looked around my living room, at my books, my clean kitchen, my rescued tabby sleeping on the windowsill, and he said, "You know, you're lucky you don't have a family. You can afford to be generous." He meant it as a compliment, I think. But it landed like a slap. Because in that moment, I realized something that had never been clearer before. Not only did Derek not respect me, he never had, and he never would. And more than that, I saw in his face what I'd always suspected about my father as well, that they both believed the life I had built, the stable, solitary, fiercely independent life that had cost me years of hard work and 1,000 private sacrifices, was some kind of consolation prize, a temporary holding pattern until I got serious and started living like them. And that's when I made my decision. Not just about the loan. About everything. Because I finally understood that trying to win their approval was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it'll never stay full. And if I couldn't be their favorite, then I'd be their reckoning. But first, I let Derek walk away from my door still thinking he had options. Still thinking I might call back and say yes. I let him believe he was still in control. Because the best part of revenge, the only part that ever truly lands, is making sure they never see it coming. By the time April rolled around, the last of the snow had melted off my balcony rail, the city smelled like thawed trash and hope, and Derek's emails had taken a very specific turn from vague entrepreneurial bluster to thinly veiled panic wrapped in charm. The kind of language you learn to decipher quickly if you've ever worked with people who mistake networking for manipulation. The subject line read, "Quick favor from your favorite brother," which was laughable, given that we both knew I was only ever contacted when something had gone wrong or was about to. I opened the message expecting a casual request, maybe help reviewing a pitch deck or connecting him with a friend in marketing, but what I got instead was a half-page confession masked as confidence, sprinkled with just enough buzzwords to make it seem like he was on the brink of something real. He was scaling up, he said, had major investor interest, and needed a temporary partner to sign on a short-term loan to bridge a liquidity gap, language that was just corporate enough to distract someone less experienced. But I've spent over a decade navigating financial smoke and mirrors, and it took me less than 5 minutes to figure out exactly what he was trying to do. Derek had no investor. He had no business. What he had was an ego, a terrible credit score, and a delusion that the right car, the right look, would finally convince the world that he was worth investing in. And that car, as it turned out, was a brand new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne, midnight blue, with custom rims and leather seats nicer than anything he'd ever owned in his entire life. I didn't reply to the email right away. I didn't even open the attachment he sent with the terms he'd worked out with a lender, someone I'd never heard of, operating through a company with no website and a Gmail address for contact. What I did was forward that email to myself, print it, and set it on my kitchen table next to a glass of wine and an old photo of us as kids, him in a Ninja Turtle shirt, me with missing teeth and pigtails, because I needed the reminder that there had been a time, long before all this noise, when I actually wanted to protect him. A week later, he called. Not texted, called, which told me how serious it was. Derek never called unless he was desperate. His voice on the other end was high-strung, rehearsed, almost painfully upbeat, like someone who knew he was 3 steps from drowning, but still trying to convince you the water was warm. He launched into his pitch the way bad salesmen do, fast, confident, filled with empty promises. I didn't interrupt. I let him talk himself in circles, let him throw around phrases like equity upside and return multiplier that he didn't understand and hoped I wouldn't challenge. And then, finally, when he paused to take a breath and waited for my response, I asked him one simple question. Why a Porsche? There was a long silence, the kind that stretches just enough to make you wonder if the line dropped. Then he said, because people don't take you seriously if you look like you're struggling. He said it like it was obvious. Like leasing a $70,000 car while buried under debt and unpaid taxes was a perfectly rational step toward success. And then he added, almost proudly, you know how it is. Image matters more than numbers these days. That was the moment something in me, something that had spent years waiting, quietly hoping for change, just stopped. I don't mean I got angry. I mean I disconnected. All the years of cleaning up after him, of absorbing the guilt our parents never gave him, of listening to our father twist himself into knots defending Derek's every failure while pretending my stability was somehow easier, less earned. It all crystallized in that one sentence. Because here he was, still believing that smoke could substitute for fire, that flash could replace substance, and that I was just another tool to be used to prop up the illusion. I told him no. Calmly, clearly, and without apology. His voice changed instantly. The charm vanished. He didn't yell, not yet, but the shift was unmistakable. He accused me of being jealous, of never wanting to see him win, and then, in a move so ironic I nearly laughed out loud, he tried to guilt me by referencing our family. What would Dad say if he knew you turned your back on me? He asked, as if our father had ever once stood on my side of the room. I told him I wasn't interested in Dad's opinion. That was the first time I'd said that out loud, and the words felt heavier than I expected, like I'd finally dropped a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. Derek went quiet again, just for a second, then dropped the mask completely. He accused me of thinking I was better than him, called me cold, accused me of living a lonely little life with nothing but money and cats, and when I didn't respond, when I just let the silence speak louder than anything I could have said, he hung up. I thought that was the end of it. But then, 3 weeks later, I saw the post. There he was, standing in front of a brand new Porsche, sunglasses on, holding the keys in one hand and a branded coffee cup in the other, with a caption that read, "Success isn't given. It's taken. Big things coming." The likes rolled in. The comments were nauseating. Old friends, former classmates, distant relatives, everyone congratulating him, calling him an inspiration, asking how they could get in on the next project. I stared at that picture for a long time, not because I believed it, but because I suddenly realized something he didn't. When someone like Derek gets what he wants through lies, it never ends there. It always comes with a cost. And this time, he didn't even know the bill was already on its way. Because what Derek didn't know, what he never thought to consider, because he assumed I'd just sulk and move on, was that I had made one call of my own. I didn't contact the shady lender he mentioned directly. That would have tipped him off. I reached out to a friend of mine, someone in risk and recovery, someone who specializes in tracking down high-interest lenders and understanding exactly who owns what once papers get signed. And within a week, I had everything I needed: names, addresses, the real structure behind the so-called business loan. And it was worse than I expected. It wasn't just a high-interest loan, it was predatory, balloon payments disguised in legalese, hidden clauses that made the car technically owned by the lender until every cent was paid, and the late fees alone would bury a normal person in 6 months. Derek had signed away his pride for a vehicle he didn't even own. He thought the story ended with me saying no. But what he didn't realize was that I had already turned the page. And I was about to start writing the ending myself. The thing about letting someone ruin themselves is that it requires a level of patience most people aren't comfortable with, because you have to be willing to sit in the discomfort. To watch someone sprint straight into a brick wall with every ounce of confidence they can fake, while you, the only one with the map, stay silent and keep your hands folded in your lap. It's not vengeance in the way people like to imagine it, dramatic, fiery, explosive. It's colder, slower, more calculated. It's the satisfaction of knowing that for once, you don't have to scream or fight or beg anyone to see the truth, because the truth is on its way, like a train no one believes is coming until the horn starts blowing through the fog. After I refused the loan and saw that ridiculous Instagram post, I didn't say a word to anyone, not to my parents, not to my friends, not even to my therapist, who'd probably been waiting for me to reach some kind of breaking point with my family for years. I just waited. Because the minute I found out who Derek's lender really was, a man named Oliver Blaine, who operated under at least 3 different business aliases, none of which had more than a P.O. box and a burner phone attached, I knew exactly how this would unfold. People like Oliver don't care about cars or status or social media impressions. They care about contracts, about clauses buried in the fine print, about how many ways they can legally bleed someone dry without ever stepping into a courtroom. Derek had signed one of the worst balloon term loans I'd ever seen in my life, and the part he hadn't even bothered to read, because of course he hadn't, was that the vehicle itself wasn't just collateral. It was, in the eyes of the contract, still property of the lender until the final payment cleared. One missed payment, and Oliver wouldn't just repossess the Porsche, he'd send someone to take it back in broad daylight and probably bill Derek for the tow. Now, I've worked long enough in finance to know that the system, on the whole, isn't designed to protect people like Derek from themselves. If you look rich, dress well, and have a charming pitch, someone will always give you rope, and it's entirely up to you whether you use it to climb or hang yourself. And Derek, God bless his delusions, thought he was on the way up, when in fact, he'd already stepped off the edge. I watched as he spiraled, slowly at first, and then with a kind of momentum you can only build when you've burned every bridge and still think you can float. It started with missed messages. He'd stopped replying to comments on his posts, stopped tagging the fake investors he used to name drop. Then came the stories, 24 hours of motivational quotes and blurry gym selfies and long captions about trusting the process, all of which were thinly disguised attempts to distract people from the fact that nothing he promised had materialized. By the time September rolled around, I knew he was behind on payments. I didn't need confirmation. I could see it in the way he started reaching out to old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in years, asking for quick meetings and just a minute of your time, which is Derek speak for I need money and I'm pretending I have something to offer. That's when I made my move. Because what Derek never knew, what I had never told anyone, even though I had considered it a dozen times over the years, was that I had started a trust fund years ago, not for myself, but for future investment opportunities. And I had done it under a separate LLC, one with no obvious ties to me, which allowed me to move and acquire assets discreetly, especially when the opportunity was too sweet to ignore. So when Oliver Blaine quietly floated a portfolio of debts to potential buyers, something lenders do when they want to offload high-risk accounts, I didn't hesitate. I bought it. Not through my name, of course, but through that same LLC. I purchased the full note attached to Derek's loan, which meant that as of October 3rd, I didn't just own the paper, I owned the car. Technically, legally, and completely. I didn't call him. I didn't warn him. I let the silence keep growing. And during that time, he kept pretending. He kept showing up at our parents' house with a smile and shiny keys, kept making noise about big opportunities just around the corner, and our dad kept eating it up like candy. He's finally turning things around, he said one night on the phone, oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind. He's finally getting serious. I didn't respond. I just made a mental note that at the next family gathering, the cards were going to fall, and for once, I wasn't going to be the one left holding the broken pieces. It's a strange thing, watching someone dig their own grave and still wave to the crowd like he's climbing a podium. There was something almost theatrical about it, the way Derek spun stories at Thanksgiving about foreign clients and expansion, while meanwhile, I had already spoken with the recovery firm scheduled to retrieve the car if he missed one more payment. The letter was already printed, sealed, and ready to drop. All I had to do was wait for the clock to hit 0. But then, something unexpected happened, something small, quiet, and easy to miss, but it stuck with me. My mother, who had been quiet through most of the dinner, leaned over while we were clearing the table and said, almost under her breath, "You've been very calm this year." And it wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't judgmental. It was observant. She saw it. She didn't know what I was doing, not yet, but she saw it. That moment mattered more than I want to admit, because I think, deep down, I had been waiting for anyone, to notice that I had changed. That I wasn't the same daughter who sat silently through lectures, who cleaned up Derek's messes in the background while our father toasted his ambition. I wasn't cleaning anymore. I was building. I was watching. I was owning. So when I finally sent the notice to Derek, an official, lawyer-reviewed document informing him that the debt had been transferred and that the lender now held the right to repossess the car at any time for breach of contract, I didn't do it with anger. I did it with clarity. I did it with the cold precision of someone who's been forced to be quiet for too long and who finally realized that silence can be a weapon too. And if he thought the holidays were tense before, he had no idea what was coming. Because this Christmas, I wasn't just showing up with wine and a fake smile. I was bringing the truth. Wrapped up in a bow and parked out front with a tow notice waiting on the windshield. There is something strangely liberating, almost disturbingly so, about knowing a storm is coming, one you orchestrated with deliberate intent and measured timing, and yet sitting quietly in the eye of it while everyone around you continues to act as though the sky hasn't darkened and the air isn't about to break open. That Christmas, as I pulled into my parents' driveway with a bottle of Cabernet in one hand and an unshakable calmness in my chest, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades, not joy, not anticipation, but control. Not the performative kind where you pretend to be above it all while seething inside, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having no doubts, no hesitations, no need to convince anyone of anything because the facts are already written, and you alone hold the pen. The house looked exactly the same as always, down to the sagging reindeer in the front yard with one eye light burnt out and the same artificial wreath that had hung on that door since the Bush administration. My mother greeted me with her usual distracted smile, her hands still flour-dusted from something she'd been baking, and while her eyes darted toward mine with something unreadable beneath the surface recognition, perhaps, or quiet curiosity, she said nothing out of the ordinary. My father, on the other hand, was in rare form, flushed with wine and cheer, already deep into his yearly campaign to remind everyone that family is what matters most, even as he subtly measured the success of that family in horsepower, square footage, and public perception. Derek, of course, made his entrance late, as always, with that same over-practiced swagger and a scarf that screamed midlife crisis, tossing his keys onto the counter with exaggerated flair, just in case anyone had forgotten what kind of car he'd arrived in. He kissed my mother on the cheek, clapped my father on the back, gave me a cursory nod like I was the help refilling the wine, and dropped into the seat across from mine like he was taking his place at a throne he assumed would always be waiting. Dinner unfolded with all the usual performances, my mother fussing over the turkey, my father steering every conversation toward Derek's recent projects, which grew more vague and contradictory the longer he spoke, and Derek basking in the glow of a spotlight he assumed was permanently affixed to his side of the table. I mostly listened, smiling when appropriate, sipping slowly, and offering no more than was expected. Because the timing mattered. Because I knew how to land a blow that didn't bruise the skin but shattered the illusion. It happened after dessert, when everyone had sunk into the kind of overfed comfort that lowers their defenses and loosens their grip on pretense. My father, likely a few glasses past dignified, lifted his wine again and said, with a half-laugh that had too much sincerity behind it, Now if only Rachel would take a page out of her brother's book, maybe we'd finally see her do something big. And there it was again, that same old line, delivered with the same blind arrogance, as though the last 10 years of my life had been a nap I refused to wake from, as though discipline, self-respect, and financial independence were character flaws he still couldn't quite forgive. I didn't flinch. I didn't roll my eyes or fire back with sarcasm. I simply leaned forward, placed my glass carefully on the table, and asked, in the same calm voice I used in boardrooms and negotiations, "Hey, Derek, did you get a letter from your lender this week?" For the first time that evening, his grin faltered. He blinked, confused, then glanced briefly at my father before replying, "What?" with that faux casual tone he used whenever he knew something was wrong but hoped no one else had caught on. I didn't wait for him to process it. I slid a plain envelope across the table toward him and said, "You should probably read that. It's from me." The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Derek stared at the envelope like it might explode. My father frowned, already bristling, and my mother, still clutching a napkin in one hand, watched Derek with a stillness I hadn't seen in her since my grandfather's funeral. When he finally opened the letter, his face changed in real time, the way a building looks when it starts to crumble at the foundation. He read quickly at first, then slowed, reread, blinked, and looked up at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he asked, though I think he already knew. "It's the purchase agreement for your loan," I said evenly. "I bought it 2 months ago. You're officially in breach of contract, and I now hold full rights to the vehicle and any associated assets." My father exploded first, as I knew he would. "Are you serious right now? You did this to your own brother?" "At Christmas." His voice rose with the kind of righteous fury he had never once reserved for Derek's scams, Derek's lies, Derek's endless messes. And in that moment, the pattern couldn't have been clearer. "I did this to a grown man who tried to use me like a stepping stone," I replied, my voice level but firm, "and then insulted me when I wouldn't help him pretend he was something he's not. I'm not sorry, and I won't apologize for refusing to co-sign someone else's fantasy." Derek stood up, muttering something under his breath, fists clenched, face flushed, but I stayed seated. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I wasn't the kid looking for approval, the sister trying to earn a seat at the table. I was the table. And for once, they could feel what it was like to be on the outside looking in. Then I offered him one final deal. "You can keep the car, Derek," I said, locking eyes with him across the table, "if you sign over your claim to the family trust. All of it. Clean and final. No stake, no voice, no right to touch what Mom and Dad leave behind." The room froze. My mother said my name quietly, once, like it was a question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. My father's jaw tightened so hard I thought he might crack a molar. "And Derek, well," Derek laughed, a dry, humorless sound with no strength behind it, and said, "You wouldn't." I smiled, not out of cruelty, but because I finally could. "Try me." He stormed out not long after, slamming the front door with all the theatrics of a man used to controlling the narrative, unaware that the story had already been rewritten without him. My father didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. My mother hugged me quietly before I left, and for once, her grip didn't feel distant or polite. It felt like something she'd been holding back for years. I walked out into the cold with the keys to Derek's Porsche in my coat pocket and no regret in my heart. And maybe some people will say I went too far. That I used power when I should have used compassion. That I turned family into business. But those people weren't sitting in that room when decades of favoritism, dismissal, and buried resentment finally boiled over into something honest. They didn't see what I saw, the truth beneath the performance, the rot behind the gold paint. Maybe I didn't grow up the way my father wanted. But I grew up knowing exactly what happens when you let people walk all over you for the sake of peace. And this year, for the first time in my life, I chose war and walked away with silence behind me and dignity intact.